afternoon to our colleagues. It's a pleasure to have everyone on the second webinar that we'll be hosting with the Africa Chinese CSOs. Today's webinar is really focused on the role of Indigenous people and local communities with respect to other effective area-based conservation measures. We look forward to a wonderful dialogue between ourselves in the next couple of hours. So today's session will have some basic ground rules, most of which most of us already know, but just for the sake of ensuring consistency, I will go over them. So the main one is about muting your audio when you are not speaking. It can be, as we all know, it can be a bit of a disturbance if we are catching background noises. So please mute your audio when you're not speaking, and when you are speaking, please put it on. The second, it's about questions. So I know many of you have questions and comments for the panelists. One way of capturing this is to actually write it down so that facilitators can capture those comments and send them to the appropriate persons on the panel. So please capture them in the chat box. The third one, which is really critical actually, is to select your interpretation option. So if you look at your screen to the far right end, you will see a bit of a globe with lines between. That's your interpretation option. Go there and select your preferred channel. If you are an English speaker, select English and then mute your device. And if you are a Chinese speaker, select Chinese. And if you are a French speaker, select French and then mute your device. That would allow you to hear in the language of your choice and stay within that channel all through. So essentially, these are the three main housekeeping rules to keep in mind. The two most important is to mute your audio when you're not speaking and to select the channel of your preference. Thank you. Please move on to the next slide, please. So what do we have planned for you today? Essentially, there are three sessions that we are engaged with today. The first session is what I've just gone through, which basically engages with the introductions. The second session really is the first webinar session. In the first webinar, we'll have three presenters, and I will introduce them appropriately at the right time. But there will be two main panelists and a discussant. The third person on that presentation is a discussant who would summarize and reflect on the presentation. And then we will go to the session on, after that, we will all go into a second webinar, which will also have three people, two presenters and a discussant. And then lastly, we'll wrap up our discussions with some concluding remarks. Please go on to the next slide. Okay, so thanks a lot. So in terms of the introductions, we have been working as African CSOs with our Chinese CSO counterparts for almost a year now. The two main entities involved here are the Chinese CSO for Biodiversity Conservation, CSABC, was founded in 2019. It aims to coordinate the NGO input in China into the Global Biodiversity Framework, COP15, that is due to happen later this year. The other party to this engagement is the Africa Biodiversity CSO Group Alliance, the Africa CSOs Biodiversity Alliance, sorry, simply known as ACBA. This was founded last year in February 2020 and has about 80 members, with about 30 being really very active. These two organizations provide an Africa and a Chinese perspective at the civil society level on issues related to the COP15 in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And we all aim to ensure that the voices of our communities are adequately heard in this process. Please move on to the next slide. So with this, let me introduce our key panelists for today. We have our very own Dr. Bura from COVID East Africa, from Cordia East Africa. I'm really sorry. Dr. Bura is the founding director of Cordia East Africa. Cordia East Africa is a knowledge organization supporting sustainability of coral reef and marine systems in the Western Indian Ocean. Cordia takes research to management and policy and builds capacity and works with stakeholders, managers, and policy makers. David's primary research is actually on coral reef resilience and within the context of climate change and biogeography of the Indian Ocean. At the boundary between science and action, that is where David basically concentrates and engages, trying to bring conservation and development together in ways that take forward the blue economy principles and links provided to global sustainability goals and targets. So that's for you, the Africa CSO speaker. We also have a Chinese colleague representing the China CSO group. Mr. Liu is a graduate of Xishan Agricultural University. He joins the Luhigo project in 2011 and has successfully worked in resource protection all this while for 10 years now. The Luhigo Protection Center manages and engages with product development that links to communities that surround the protected area. Currently, Mr. Liu is responsible for coordinating scientific research institutions and related protected areas to jointly develop and design participatory ecological experiences and products for conservation. So that's Mr. Liu. We have one more presenter in the person of Adamu Adija. Adamu Adija will be our discussant, and she is an Mboroboro Indigenous woman from Cameroon. She's a graduate with honors degree from the International Politics Program of the University of South Africa, UNISA. She holds a certificate in Indigenous People's Rights at the Center for Human Rights within the University of Pretoria. And she is also engaged with the Indigenous Women's Global Leadership School. She's currently completing her master's degree in international politics in UNISA, which focuses on Indigenous diplomacy as an alternative conflict resolution mechanism by Indigenous people. So these are your three very capable participants and panelists. And I think at this point, we will begin the conversation with David presenting first to us. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Fred. Good morning, good evening to everybody on the call. So if I can share my screen, please, so I can share my presentation. I'm actually, fortunately, speaking to you from Tsavo East National Park. So it's great to be talking in a workshop about conservation in one of Kenya's, foremost protected areas. I'd hope that I could show you the waterhole. I'm afraid the network wasn't good enough there, so I have to do it from here. And I hope you can see my screen now. And if you're seeing the view, please let me know and I can switch things around. What I'll try and do in the kickoff to this session is to take a step back from, I work on coral reefs, and I'll finish my presentation with coming to other effective conservation measures, new opportunities for conservation in Africa with respect to fisheries and coral reefs and marine ecosystems. But to set the stage for that, within ACBA, myself as the ACBA members have really been thinking hard in the context of the Global Biodiversity Framework and the COP coming up in China about how do we really move the agenda forward and really promote conservation in our contexts where we have growing population, large rural populations that really depend on nature and need to thrive alongside nature. So in addition to the major conservation areas we have, like Savo East, where I am, how do we really do conservation and sustainability where people are so they value it? So we've come up with this idea. We've titled it Securing Nature from the Ground Up. Sorry, I'm in the lobby of the lodge here as some people are moving in and out. So how can we promote local action in shared spaces to meet nature people positive goals? And so I'll go through that. And as I mentioned, this is in the context of what has happened with the Aichi targets in the last 10 years, in which we know that there's been a lot of effort on conservation and a lot of it has been very successful, and it's necessary. And the protected areas and the species work that have been invested in are essential for nature's survival, but they haven't been enough. And how do we move forward in the Global Biodiversity Framework for the next 30 years? So thinking about the bigger picture of moving forward, it's not just about the next few years, the next 10 years, but we're really setting an agenda for the long term. And one question I always think in Kenya with the marine systems is what scope is there for expanding traditional conservation approaches, so the marine protected areas that we have. And to be honest, there's not a lot along the coastline. We already have a very populated coastline. It's very heavily utilized. And there's not a desire for new protected areas amongst community members. There's a very large population of small scale fishers. This also relates to terrestrial work and agriculture as well, in terms of smallholder farming. And an important point to make about these as well is that there's nothing small about these. When you add up all of the people and all of the space that is occupied, small scale fisheries and smallholder farming, rural communities really cover a lot of the space on our planet. And these are the places where we need to work out how to make conservation work in the coming years. So where are we today? Where is Africa with respect to the Aichi targets? And of course, the one we know the best is Aichi Target 11 because it's based on area under protection. That's the easiest one to measure in terms of impact on the ground. And we know that on land, the target was 17%, on ocean, the target was 10%. In Africa, the reports are that we've achieved 14 and 3% respectively. So we've done quite well on land. We haven't done so well in the sea yet. This is largely through protected areas, whether government, community, private, and mixed models. The finance primarily comes from tourism and government and donor support. And then who benefits? The focus is really, so issues around protected areas, there's a big focus on human-wildlife conflicts, of course, interactions between wildlife and people, and because of encroachment and population growth amongst people. And there's issues around the equity of how benefits are shared and also the burdens of conservation in terms of human-wildlife conflicts. So moving forward, what we want to do, thinking through this as an Africa CSO Alliance, is we want to support ambition in reversing nature's decline. We want to push towards integrated targets across people and nature because we don't feel that separating people from nature can be done anymore. The world is too populated and there's too many demands on the Earth's natural systems. We need to focus on nature and nature services or nature's contributions to people in working land and seascapes. And we need to focus squarely on the rights, custodianship, and governance and equity of how nature is managed across these spaces. So there is a big push forward towards the other effective conservation measures. There's been a lot of interest in these over the last 10 years. The definitions have come out, the working groups, specialist groups working on these, but we haven't ramped them up quickly enough. We feel that this is really where the rubber will hit the road or where the opportunities are in the coming years. So of course, we're looking at an African or developing country approach in order to be able to do it our way and call on all to join and support this endeavor in moving forward. And of course, the approach needs to be contextualized for every location in Africa, but also beyond. And hopefully this is of interest in China as well. So looking in a little bit more detail at the state of nature. Now, this is from the IPBES Global that came out in 2019. And what these graphs show is the condition of land and ocean, the up to from 0 to 100%. These are global numbers. So 25% of land is unimpacted, 55% is altered, 20% is under intensive agriculture, and 1% is urban. The ocean is somewhat different, 3% unimpacted, 95% altered in one way or another, and approximately 1% is estimated to be heavily altered by people. And of course, we don't live on the ocean, so that's the big difference between what happens on land and on the ocean. Now, if we look at the Aichi targets in terms of this condition of nature, what has happened up until now is that biodiversity actions, so protected areas and other actions, have really focused on the most intact places, the best parts of nature. And of course, it's necessary to try as hard as we can to make sure that there's no further loss of critical parts of nature. So a lot of the action is focused on the left-hand side of these graphs, both inland and in sea. And that makes sense. But a big concern in moving forward in Africa, particularly with all the concern about equity and what happens to people around protected areas, is if we move forward with the new goals, which are targets, which are likely to be to 30%, under target 2 in the GBF at the moment, if we use the same approach as in the past, that additional 13% of land will be added on to the current 17% in the best parts of nature. And of course, in the ocean, we'll be going to 10% to 30% in the best places. And there's a huge amount of concern in Africa amongst communities and others about, well, what about people in these places? There's a lot of criticism, and there has been, about the conservation movement, about loving wildlife or animals or nature more than people. And I don't think it shouldn't be like that. And I think we can turn that dialogue around, or that discourse. And we propose to do it using a model we're looking for a name for it. Currently we have a manuscript which will hopefully come out in Science magazine in the coming weeks, but more of a shared model for Earth and ocean spaces. So starting from the baseline, which is the 17% on land, I'm showing here, but the same can be said for the ocean, and to spread this action across all land and seascapes. So across all of these altered and degraded spaces as well, we need to have conservation. So what that happens is that if you share the new conservation across the axis, the proposal is to meet the new targets through conservation that happens not just in the best and the most intact places, but adding on to what we already have in the 17%, to really invest in places where people benefit from nature. These places provide NCPs, nature's contributions to people, or ecosystem services. And the focus is really on people and nature together. And the other thing about it, sorry, let me just add these arrows. So that's the 17% that we already have. This is the additional conservation action in shared spaces. There's guidance out now in the literature. 20% of all areas down to local levels under natural or native habitat provides sufficient ecosystem services or benefits to people for agriculture and pollination, for water supply, and other things like that. So 20% of any area is advised to be under natural habitat. So can we get to that? And the idea then also is that we really, and in cities and heavily populated areas, perhaps a lower percentage is a bit more practical. But the idea is to address multiple targets. So it's not just about conserving nature, but it's also about supplying benefits to people. And this really supports the Sustainable Development Goals in a major way. And there's a very large supporting literature behind this approach. So I think it can be argued very strongly. Now, there's a couple of things about this approach that we think is very powerful and that we'd like to highlight. So this is the basic model, just showing this adds up to 30%, which would meet the new target 2 with the GBF. But how do you, of course, depending on the state of nature, you could achieve this through many different mechanisms. So a large part of it, sort of green, could be under traditional protected areas or wilderness or IPLC lands where there's very low population density and traditional management. Other effective conservation measures in orange could supply a part of the area, and the proportion of other effective conservation measures could increase perhaps in areas of higher population density, because there may not be scope for either there's no wilderness in heavily populated areas left, and there may not be space for traditional protected areas. So this model can incorporate a lot of different mechanisms of achieving, of governing these spaces. And then the other thing, of course, is that as you go to the right on the x-axis, a lot of that space is already degraded or is already utilized. So the proportion of space that is under restoration or regeneration increases towards the right. Of course, it takes a long time for restoration for new habitat, restored areas to regain the values or the functions that intact areas have. But we need to do restoration anyway, and we're at the beginning of the decade of ecosystem restoration. So long as the measures are correct for really being able to justify when an area meets certain criteria for being restored or regenerated or having high function, then I think that there's possibility to include this in the model. So this is really about integrated targets and meeting multiple targets at the same time. Of course, area is one of the easiest ones to focus on and to put boundaries on a map and on land or in the sea, but not as an apex target, not as the primary target. We have to achieve other targets alongside. So what's next with this? So as I said, we've prepared this scientific or policy paper, which is under review right now. We're really pitching and communicating to African and other delegations in the CBD negotiations. So SBSTA is currently ongoing, as many of you know, I'm sure. The open-ended working group on the GBF will be meeting in early August, and of course, COP15 in Kunming later in the year. And then also outreach and discussions with key groups, so such as the China CSOs, yourselves. How interesting is this in your context? How does it match with the idea, with the mechanisms that you have in place in China? You have the redlining approach, which we've heard a lot about. Does this also match with an idea such as greenlining, perhaps, where you're really focusing on nature and people together? And then also the nature positive 30 by 30 campaigns, a high ambition for nature coalition. They're really pushing for protecting the best and really ramping up to 30% protection, but how? And we would really like to make sure that the African voice is strongest in determining how we come to that in Africa. And of course, other continents will have somewhat different perspectives on this. So this idea of nature people positive and shared earth along the bottom, that's what we're hoping to. So if I bring this to just to the sea, just to finish on small scale fisheries, I'm afraid I won't say a lot about these. I work in Kenya, so in East Africa, on Western Indian Ocean. There's an estimate that there's 250,000 fishers, 250,000 jobs directly dependent on small scale fisheries. So that's the fishermen, the market sellers and others. So this is a large population. And of course, their families are dependent on this income. The larger extended value chains that those fish go into. So these fisheries are really important. They operate at a large scale across this whole region. They employ a lot of people, and they're very dependent on these primary coastal assets that you can value, that we can put dollars on them. But the key thing is the people and the system functioning that is important, and really understanding what the potential is for moving forward. So in terms of other effective conservation measures, so scientists, communities, the governments as well, the fisheries departments across these countries are all really circling around what we're calling locally managed marine areas. They're different terminology in different countries and different regions, so that the term isn't so important. But really what these do is that they provide an alternative community level governance mechanism. And this is where the community leaders, the fisher leaders, essentially form a collaboration with the government, with the fisheries department, to co-manage fisheries together. So they have authority on the ground, they can set bylaws, and they can really a direct link to the government to facilitate good governance and sustaining nature on the ground. So they deliver positive socioeconomic and conservation outcomes. They're inclusive, equitable, participatory, particularly when they're done right. And of course, it takes a lot of effort to do that right. Managing small-scale fisheries is a large part of the LMMA strategy, so managing fisheries well. And LMMAs tend to include, so there's fishing within the locally managed marine areas, but there will be a core zone within the larger area that might be fully protected or have seasonal closures and so on. And that's all oriented around managing fishing efforts and sustaining the fish stocks and the habitats within. Now, we've been working on this extensively in Kenya and Madagascar in the last 10 to 15 or even 20 years now. And they follow very much in on that for fisheries and the ecosystem approach to fish, the FAO, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, espouses. So in this sense, really working out between conservation and fisheries, between UNEP and the CBD and FAO is really an essential dialogue to happen at global levels, but then also coming all the way down to national and subnational levels within each country. So in the last few months in our regional context here, so a group of collaborating organizations, so Dr. Militis Samoilis, who leads the fisheries side of work within Cordio, has led this with our partners along the bottom, really looking at the current situation, context, and the drivers affecting small-scale fisheries on the East African coast. So we know that marine and coastal biodiversity is declining. This is because of inadequate protected area coverage, because of inadequate community involvement and poor management of those fisheries. And all of this leads to inadequate long-term funding for marine conservation, or that's sort of the nexus that really impedes resolving these root causes. So we've made three main policy recommendations on the right, and this is at the regional level. So around ocean governance and to fit into new interest in blue economy frameworks and the SDGs. So the first one is that coastal fishing communities should be empowered to implement locally managed marine areas. The second recommendation is that sustainable management of small-scale fisheries should be prioritized through increase in size of protected areas, enforcement of fishing gear regulations, and threatened species protection. And then the third one is that blue economy and MSP, this marine spatial planning, should really be used to help drive long-term funding to finished areas. So we're trying to bring these sort of recommendations to the countries for them to implement them in a coordinated way. So I'll just finish. So sort of this fisheries work, which I finished with on nature-based livelihoods, has really come out of 20 years of work at this level, struggling with how to make fisheries management sustainable and really protect nature at the same time. And then thinking in the broader scale with the opportunity with the Global Biodiversity Framework is how do we really make sure that we're not just doing the water conservation that we think about in protected areas. We need to extend that across all of the spaces that these small-scale fisheries operate in, so that they, especially at the community level, they really drive the management of these areas to sustain their fisheries. So I'll finish with that. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, David, for leading us through a very powerful presentation. I will now call on, in the interest of time, I will call upon our next presenter. I believe it's Mr. Liu, to present another perspective with respect to other effective conservation measures. So over to you, Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Fred. 刘老师，我会帮你来放那个 PPT 哈。Can you see it?
啊，能看到。
好的，你如果要放到下一页，你就可以告诉我就行了。
哎，好啊，大家下午好，我是老河沟中心主任刘晓根，我今天来给大家分享一下，就是说老河沟社会公益性保护地的一个实践。在老河沟保护地，一共从正式落地到现在，一共是有10年的时间了。在讲老河沟之前，然后我们 要介绍一下，就是说桃花源基金会。桃花源基金会的前身是四川西部自然保护基金会，是2012年成立的。这个成立呢，然后它就是来支持老河沟社会公益性保护地的就是落地。到在那个期间呢，然后西部自然基金会，四川西部自然基金会实际上是在TNC 中国部，然后统一管理下。然后到2015年，然后独立出来，然后专注于做这个自然地保护地的，就说这种尝试。老河沟自然保护区呢，一共是110平方公里，它实际上包含了再下一页它一共包含了有3个流域。哎，张先应该是再往下，能听到吗？喂，能听到吗？
Yes, I can hear you. Gia, can you turn to the next page?
对，再下一页，谢谢。老河沟这个保护地呢，一共是110平方公里，它3个流域有之前的一个就相当于一个国有林场，然后它比较大，然后是78平方公里，然后还包括了就是说有2个相对小一点的流域，一共是42平方公里，这样合在一块儿就是110平方公里。然后这是这么一个大概的这么一个区位，它处在平武的，就是说东北边然后在整个四川的，就是说最北边。老河沟就是社会公益性保护地落地呢，它一共就是说签了3个协议，加上1个批文。首先是2012年的时候，请往下，再下一页，谢谢。再下一页，对，然后在这边呢，然后我们一共签了就是说3个协议，以及获得了政府的一个批文，使它这个就是说这个身份的活发化。第一个是2012年的时候，然后平武县政府和桃花源签订了一个50年的委托管理的协议，将老河沟110平方公里的林地委托给了基金会来管理。2013年9月的时候，平武县批复成立了平武县老河沟自然保护区然后这就标志着中国第一个社会公益性保护地正式落地在平武。在这个期间呢，然后就是说这个中心还跟平武县林业局签署了一个协议，叫那个就相当于这个管理的协议，因为在我们国家所有的林地都是政府在就说这个来管理，然后所以说不是跟林业局然后签署了一个协议，来正式的就说由林业局来作为我们的监管机构来进行就说认可我们的管理。同时因为之前然后这个地方呢它是一个林场在这个地方它还有一些资产，所以说桃花源基金会还跟就是这个林场还签订了一个就是说相当于资产转让的协议，然后把之前的这些资产然后就说来转化成就说这个用于保护的这么一些设施设备是这样然后在这个完成了之后呢，然后2014年1月，然后我们在这边成立了一个在地的这么一个民办非企业，叫平武县老河沟自然保护中心，这么获得了一个民非的牌照，来作为在地这么一个管理机构。整个的然后就说这个就说管理呢，每一年然后差不多营运经费是360万。那整个的特点呢，它就是社会参与、民间管理和政府监督。下面就是获得的，就是说相当于当时获得的一些协议。在老河沟保护区成立之前呢，这个地方实际上是一个林场。 这个林场呢，主要是为采伐森林，就说采伐木材是它的主要的业务。所以说当时，然后就说凡是涉及木材，就说林木管理的这一块，然后当地还就说这个林场还是比较重视的。但对野生动物保护这个呢，然后其实关注度就不够。虽然这个地方它也是大熊猫的一个非常核心的栖息地，但是偷猎呀、电鱼呀，包括挖药啊，然后这些干扰、人为干扰，其实非常严重。请到第7页。我是2011年，然后来老濠沟工作的，那会儿差不多10年前。我当时来了，然后就是带大家，然后来做这个保护以及就是本地调查，所以说主要的工作实际上是野外工作。我在第1周，然后上山，然后就听到3次打猎的枪响，然后前半年实际上就说有很多的野外的这种工作经历呢，只发现了6次。就说之前就说当地就说主要的这么一些打猎的这些经济的动物，比如说像羚牛啊黑熊啊这些东西。我记得，然后在2016年12月，就说一个下大雪的这么一天，我们的一个巡护员，就是这个图上最外面的就说这个巡护员，然后临近傍晚的时候，然后过来跟我说，他们刚结束了一次高海拔的巡护，然后跟我说他们在山上听到了枪响。当时我们马上组织全体能上山的人，然后就上山去，在他听到声音附近，然后蹲守。那个地方海拔是2500米。第二天，然后我们又分了3个组，然后去找线索。结果就说，因为它下大雪嘛，所以说不是只要有人在这个在里面活动的话，很容易就会发现有痕迹。结果忙活了一天，然后没有找到任何的线索。后面我们推断然后可能是就是那冬天，然后它有那个雪融化了之后，它会在一些岩壁上，然后形成冰柱，那个冰柱断裂了，然后可能掉下去，如果比较高，然后它会发出很大的声音，它就有一点像，就是说如果隔得远的话，有一点像枪声，所以说他就发生了误判。但最令人欣慰的是，就是这个过程然后我们所有的巡护员没有一个人有责备过小薛，然后所以说在这个里面，然后我就说，直到我们这个保护地落地5年，我们整个团队然后对盗猎基本上达成了一个就是说零容忍的这么一个态度。下一页。然后这个就是保护工作随着就是不断的发展，我们发现，然后实际上在我们这个110平方公里这么个范围内呢，然后我们的动物其实也慢慢的恢复了。我们能发现的就是在我们既有的这些巡护线路上能发现的这个盗猎的威胁也都控制在1到2次，就是每1年然后只有1到2次。然后到去年的夏天，然后我们去年的夏天，然后我们就说其实再来反思，实际上我们发现就是我们现在执行的这么一个巡护呢，其实存在2个就是说2个缺陷。第一个呢，然后就是说在我们就是说现有的这些线路呢，它实际上很难把我们整个保护地然后来进行覆盖。实际上这是一方面。第二方面，实际上已超过这个110平方公里，在我们之外，然后就说这些林地呢，然后我们其实也很难就说来评估到底它的盗猎的威胁这个情况，然后也没有。所以说在去年的夏天，然后我们就把我们里面以及外面一共是260平方公里的这个森林外面实际上就社区的嘛这些森林，然后一块儿然后纳入到我们的整个巡护的这么一个范围内260平方公里。这要求就是根据威胁不同，然后来要求每一个公里分成1乘1平方公里的网格，每一个网格呢，然后要求1年然后要去最少4次，每一个巡护员1年要把这260个公里网格然后走上2次然后这是我们最开始7月28号一直到12月31号然后覆盖的这么一个情况。然后基本上就是说 到我们这里面，然后基本上就是说已经开始进行一个全覆盖。然后在下面的1月1号，然后到3月21号，然后我们看到就是说我们一方面讲，然后就是说因为周边老百姓在过年的时候都会回家嘛，外出打工都会回家，所以说在外围是比较有比较大的一个保护的就这个压力。同时呢，然后我们也看到就是说我们的整个团队，然后就说这个覆盖，就说这个效率，就是野外工作能力，其实也得到了很大的提升，就说比刚开始就说我们来执行这个就说决策，然后要提升，就说要提高很多，它的效率也就提高了。这是我们在就说去年开始，然后进行了一些就说巡护方面的一些调整，然后一方面然后进行对我们里面进行全覆盖，第二方面然后把我们的巡护扩展到周边的一些社区。我们都知道，就是说保护区的就是说这种干扰主要来自周边的社区，所以说我们周边老河沟周边一共有7个村，我们从2012年开始工作，然后从定植农业、自然教育到现在还更为综合的一些社区项目，我们逐渐跟社区的关系呢越来越融洽，并抓住机会，然后促成了3个保护小区的成立。这3个保护小区就是新沂、官坝以及福寿，在这个图上有。然后今年就上一周，我们还跟山河沟也签署了社区保护地的这么一个协议。所以说，我们逐渐的，然后来带动周边社区老百姓，然后来让他们成立社区巡护队，然后管理了他们80平方公里的这么一个森林保护力量，在这个区域保护力量也从0增加到了50名巡护员，其中有20名专业的巡护员以及30名社区的巡护员。接下来我们还会在周边的百灵，然后民主，还包括和平，然后也来开展工作，让整个保护区的周边，然后形成一道绵密的缓冲带。这样的话，然后既扩展了我们的就是说保护的同盟军，也使盗猎人员害怕、忌惮，然后最终放弃盗猎。我们在周边社区除了支持他们做社区保护地外，我们还让我们每一个巡护员，然后跟周边老百姓，然后来努力打成一片。我们实行了就是说这种社区的访谈，然后我们就除了上山之后，然后主要的精力，然后就是到社区，一方面去认识我们周边的村民邻居，第二方面呢，然后在这个过程中，我们也了解到，然后他们的一些困难，然后并提供我们力所能及的帮助。这样的话，然后我们渐渐的跟周边老百姓能成为朋友，让他们理解，进而支持我们的工作。这张图呢，然后就是我们支持的新沂保护地的就是说他们社区巡护队的一个全家福。这画面上的这8个人，其中只有之前都是猎人，并且当中呢只有1个人没有因为打猎进监狱。现在他们经过3年的保护，在社区他们的社区保护地里清理出来大量的猎套、猎家，还缴了1支枪，阻止了很多批挖药的人，也同时也阻止了就是说这种火灾的隐患，然后在林区。我们除了就是说以上的就是说巡护和社区，然后这2块工作，我们还每天要求我们所有的巡护员，然后每天然后养成打扫清洁的习惯。然后因为打扫卫生是每个人然后都能做的事，我们是希望就是说通过打扫卫生，一方面让我们呢就是说这种环境然后更好，我们住得更舒服。同时呢，然后我们都知道，然后在这个山区的保护地里，然后基本上清一色都是大老爷们儿，然后大家其实对这个工作，甚至是这种工作标准，然后包括卫生标准，其实是一般能凑合就过了，就可以了。所以说这也是我们然后通过就是说每一天来打扫清洁，让我们的就是说这种环境更好，同时也不断的打磨我们对这个工作标准的这么一个态度，然后让我们的工作就是说这种标准越来越高。 经过差不多10年的这么一个就是说保护，然后在2018年的时候，2017年的时候，然后我们在这边已经能发现水獭了，然后这个水獭实际上在这个河里，就是我们这个河里已经消失了20多年了，然后水獭回来了，那也就意味着我们就是说这种水生态系统，然后逐渐的来恢复，已经得到了很大程度的一个恢复。同时，这个画面上这个是林柳，这是我们整个岷山最大的一个有蹄类动物，这也是之前所有猎人最喜欢打的这么一个动物。现在的话，然后在我们老河沟，然后看到林柳也是一件很稀松平常的事，在公路上然后都能看到林柳了。现在，去年的7月8号。央视还报道了有一只也是大熊猫跑到了老河沟保护站的新闻。这个呢，然后正是我们的巡护员正在就是说公路上清理边沟，相当于做清洁的时候，然后有一只大熊猫，然后就跑到了就是我们的一个保护站，然后巡护员用手机记录下来，然后这个情景，然后在这个新闻中呢，社会公益性保护地这个新名词第一次被直接用来向公众传播，老河沟的模式也开始被社会所知晓。由于我们的保护成效，所以说去年大熊猫国家公园在设立基层保护站的时候，然后政府也对我们的工作非常信任，将老河沟边上有43平方公里国家公园的这个区域也交给我们管理。所以说我们现在老河沟的管理的面积一共是153平方公里了。以上差不多就是我们正在做的，就是说桃花源的，就是说说的这个保护地的3门基础工作，就是上山下乡和刷厕所。经过差不多10年的这么一个发展，老河沟桃花源已经从老河沟起步，在全国建立了6个像老河沟这样的社会公益性保护地。最新的一个呢是在浙江衢州的江山。这个因为做图的时候没显示上去，这上面有5个，有四川的老河沟，四川乐山的八岳岭，吉林、象海，象海、安徽黄山的九龙峰，以及湖北太阳坪社会公益性保护地。现在就说桃花源已经落地了6个社会公益性保护地。老河沟的就是社会公益性保护地的实践大概就介绍到这里。看看大家有什么问题，谢谢大家。另外就是然后我们同事那个田丰，然后是整个桃花源社区方面的专家以及负责人，然后社区这一块看看田老师这边有没有补充。
没有，谢谢，我不在这段发言。
Thank you very much, Mr. Liu, and thanks for the translation. That was really powerful. So we basically had two models. One model that reflects on the use of spaces beyond pristine spaces to other shared spaces, community-related spaces alongside potentially even urban spaces. So the concept of shared earth and oceans within the marine space was also quite well articulated by David. What we've just had is a different kind of experience, which really looks at restoration of previously a forest farm. So that restoration program actually extends beyond your normal pristine spaces, and it gives a greater chance for conservation as well. It's amazing what you've been able to do on both ends, and the concepts as we've had it, are complementary. Thank you very much. Without taking up too much space, I will now call upon Adamu to provide reflections on the 2 presentations that we've had, and then share her own thoughts around other effective conservation measures that she may have for us. Over to you, Adamu.
Thank you for giving me this place. Sorry, I'll be speaking to camera due to connection. Thank you, presenters. It was an amazing presentation from all of you. And I did pick up some of your thoughts on this topic. Speaking from the point of view of IPLCs, I think we all know that IPLCs are the ones who live in nature, and they are naturally conservative since time immemorial. So I feel like other effective conservation measures for IPLCs, it's a very important thing, and especially in the role they will be playing in the post-2020 Global Diversity Framework. So from my points of view, other effective conservation measures that I think IPC lands and waters and territories should be taken into consideration and regarded as a safe category from protected. IPLCs, we recognize the abuse of nature and people as if we are going to be, sorry, excuse me. IPLCs recognize the abuse of nature and people in protected areas, and we call on conservationists to take into consideration the relationship between human and nature and how they interrelate with each other in terms of conservation. We also recognize the protected areas that see IPLCs as their enemies instead of valuing them as contributors in protected areas. Especially in Africa, we recognize that most of the protected areas see IPLCs as the enemies of conservation, while naturally they are the ones who preserve nature and should not be looked at as enemies of nature. I want to also highlight on target 2, IPLC should be recognized as a sustainable management approach, and IPLC knowledge, practices, and management are sustainable use as determined by IPLC governance and systems and management of practices. Target 2 should not be limited to protected areas as such. So therefore, IPLC governance, systems, and management should be taken into consideration. I want to also highlight the role of IPLCs in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. As a new paradigm for conservation, we are calling on a new concept to protected and conserved areas in which the rights of IPLCs are fully respected and secured. We also calling on the accountability to be built up on the final agreement in which a human rights-based approach should be taken into consideration. I'll also discuss about the policies, especially in the African continent on conservation. Most of the governments in Africa see IPLCs as the enemies of the environment, where we call on the government to see the IPC as collaborators in conservation instead of regarding them as destructive agents of conservation. We also calling on the government to apply human rights-based approach in conservation of nature and wildlife. So those are the few points that I think I'll highlight from this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adamu. Great points. For David and for Mr. Liu, there are 2 questions that we have for you. First with David. So David, the question here is the idea of shared earth and oceans. It's a powerful one, and that embracing that across all spaces it's a good idea. But how is that going to be accomplished when we are already challenged with protected area management that has a fairly clear management and governance arrangement? How do you provide for support and effective management of other spaces outside protected areas where it's a bit more complex? So given the complexity of other spaces, how is that going to happen? So that's your question, David. The question for you, Mr. Liu, relates to incentives for communities. You did refer to the fact that communities are getting engaged, and then you also mentioned that the population is returning back to the Old Creek Nature Reserve area. But how do you keep communities incentivized to be a part of conservation? You really need an incentive measure to ensure continuity and commitment. So how do you maintain the incentives to ensure that communities are engaged and supporting conservation? So those are two questions that have come up that I want to share with you. Maybe David, you can respond to yours first.
Okay, thank you, Fred. And thank you, Mr. Liu, for your presentation. I thought that was a really inspiring demonstration of engagement and how, real, as a question comes, real motivation actually happens on the ground. So I'm very interested in your answer to that one also. But I would say in answer to the question you posed for me, that yes, it's complicated. So I'm an ecological scientist, and I can see the state of nature, and I've studied interactions of people with nature as well. And I see the need for this approach because I think the state of our shared spaces in Kenya, East Africa, is troublesome. Environmental degradation is affecting very much the productivity of the land for farmers and of the sea for fishermen, as well as the state of nature. So it will be very challenging to work out how to govern, conservation or nature management across all of these areas where we're already challenged with managing nature in protected areas. But that's the key thing that also Adamu brought up as well, is that the power, the authority really has to go down to the local level. So local authorities in government and local authorities in communities are representative of the people and of cultures that are in place. They really need to, or mechanisms need to be established for joint responsibility and authority to manage these. And then for individuals or households or villages that have authority over space, for example, if you own a farm and you have 10 acres of a farm in a rural area, then can you put 2 acres of your 10 under native vegetation to restore it for the wood that can also be harvested if you plant the right trees, for the bees and pollination that your farm benefits from? Perhaps the water catchment will improve, so the water supply for your crops are improving. If it's a village and you're managing grazing lands for pastoralist communities, can you manage the grazing of the livestock of your community such that 20% of the area is really in very good, healthy state? It'll be used for some things, but you do need to make sure that really damaging practices are excluded from those spaces, because that area does provide benefits locally. And I think the key thing is that if local residents receive the benefits of nature in those areas, they will be the ones most strongly invested in protecting it, just as has happened traditionally with IPLCs, as we've heard. So I think working out how to get that, local authority management of nature in the right ways across different landscapes and seascapes is what needs to happen. And it'll be challenging. There's nothing easy about it. But if we don't do it, we'll just continue to lose more nature. So I think it's really a central priority for the new Global Biodiversity Framework to address that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I couldn't agree more with you that getting local communities and local people alongside urban people engaged in protecting their spaces is going to be fundamental to addressing the issue of conservation. Especially because it brings home the big problem, which is consumption and production. And so if everyone begins to take action in their spaces, then we can see change happen. That said, that it is going to be challenging, and we will need to invest collectively in these spaces and in the governance arrangements alongside providing incentives for these communities that are outside protected areas and the urban areas to begin to invest a little bit more, actually more than a little bit more, significantly more than we've been doing in the past. And it's only by working across all spaces that we can potentially see the shifts that we desire. So thanks a lot for that elaboration. Mr. Liu, over to you in terms of incentives for communities. What is the incentive mechanism that you've created that allows for the communities around the Old Creek to continue to support your work?
小哥
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
小哥在叫你呢。
我听不懂。
他说有一个激励机制的问题。
I'm not sure, but I can't hear the interpretation.
So maybe I can respond for your questions.
选择中文的。
小哥没选择中文的 ，OK， 好，要不我来帮你回答好吗？那个小哥。Okay, I will respond to you instead of Liu Xiaoge because I still work Paradise Foundation also, and I just took charge on the job of the local community jobs. So for the okay, I think the best thing is I respond to you in Chinese, and you can use the interpreter. 就激励机制来说呢，这个地方的激励机制，其实我特别同意刚才那个奥布拉所说的，每个地方是不一样的，那每一个社区有它自己不一样的特质，所以这个激励机制的具体的设计都会很不一样。但是作为一个大的原则来讲，我们来看还是有一些共性的，我就它的共性来做一点回应。第一块共性呢，就是中国政府对于偷盗猎本身有比较严格的法律，而且这个执法是越来越严格了，所以这其实形成了一个大的一个环境，这是一个压力，这个压力的环境。那就社区而言呢，那有这么几条。第一条呢，就是这个激励机制不是我们想要在一个社区去做什么，而首先去基于当地老百姓他关注哪些问题，某些问题是跟保护环境相关联的。那对于当地老百姓来讲，保护好环境对于他自己来说是有一些好处的。比如说刚才刘先生提到的那个社区的巡护队本身好多就是当年的猎人，一个重要原因就是我们做的第一件事儿就是让当地的猎人不是直接去保护熊猫，而是去保护他们当地的野生的药材资源。那保护野生的药材资源本身就是当地人的意愿，而不再是这个作为保护者的意愿。这是第一条，保护的意愿来自于他们自己。第二条就是当他们把他们的这个野生药材的资源要保护好的时候，他一定需要他自己社区内部有一个非常好的自我管理的一个组织和规则。这就像那个奥布拉先生所说的一样的，他的治理的模式。在这个基础上，我们支持他们去把自己的药材管理好的同时，他自身就实现了他自己的组织建设和他自己的治理的这个建设。那在这个基础上，我们再去叠加说我们想要的保护大熊猫、保护野生动物，这时我们就推着它往前走了一步。但推着它往前走的一步呢，我们会有承诺，这个承诺就是我们过去说的协议保护，就是 conservation agreement 在中间提到的一个原则，什么呢？就是我来帮助你发展你的生计，但是这不是白帮你的，而是说这个发展生计是你为保护做出了贡献，我给你的奖励。所以我们在那儿做的方法就是，第一年你们保护好药材资源，第二年你们开始保护大熊猫，大熊猫保护好了，我们就投入更多的资金来帮助你们发展生计。比如在一个村儿，我们是帮助他们 发展这个改良当地的一个核桃树啊，在帮助他们去建立他们的这个民间的小旅馆。那这是一个一步一步的，就让他们一个社区中间的一部分这种精英分子开始转变他的生活方式，跟着我们的脚步一步一步的走向做保护，这是一个循序渐进的过程。所以说这个激励机制，第一是外部的一个大的压力环境，第二是内部的一个交换的环境，说你对保护做了贡献，我来帮助你做生计的改善，这是一个当地人都能理解的逻辑。再有一个呢，就是他最初的那个原生的动力一定来自于他们自己，而不是来自于我强迫你要去做保护。所以有这3条，我认为是一个保证现在在老河沟的周边这么多个村儿都能慢慢的跟随保护的这个需要，开始从过去的这种不可持续的利用发展到配合保护到可持续利用的这个模式上。好，我回答完了，谢谢。
Thank you very much, Mr. Tieng. Great explanation, and it's also consistent with what David was sharing in terms of incentives to communities at the coast. I want to thank Mr. Liu for the powerful rendition around restoration of protected areas through this old creek nature reserve. The outcome there was very powerful, and thanks for sharing the lessons of that work. Also, maybe thanks to the Paradise Foundation for investing so much in this work. We're really grateful for the global good you've provided through that effort. David, thanks for sharing, as usual, the concepts of shared earth and ocean spaces. I think it's a powerful concept, but also thanks for bringing it to reality with the example you've given of the communities at the coast. So thanks for both of you. Adamu, thanks for sharing the rights perspective and the role that Indigenous and people alongside local communities can play going forward. And we hope that your suggestions will be captured as we go forward to COP15 in Kunming. So thank you all. Now we'll move to the second set of presenters, and perhaps my facilitators can help. Okay, thanks a lot. So we have 2 main presenters this time. We have Lucy Mulinke and Ms. Cheng, and on the side we do have a discussant, Mr. Tian, whom we've heard already from briefly. And I'll introduce very briefly Lucy. Lucy is one of Africa's leading leaders of Indigenous people. She is the executive director of the Indigenous Information Network. She's also the co-chair of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And lastly, she's also the founder of the Indigenous Women in Biodiversity Network and African Indigenous Women's Groups organizations. I have met Lucy on several occasions. She's a compelling speaker, a passionate one for Indigenous people, and one that truly articulates the role of Indigenous communities within this COP15 process, the Global Biodiversity Framework. The second speaker we will have is Ms. Cheng, and she is a program officer of the Ecosystem Conservation and Community Development Program at GEI. GEI is an organization in China that promotes conservation. And she has a background in conservation science and stewardship and biodiversity. She's leading in sustainable community development programs and projects in Myanmar and in Western China. So she works outside China as well. She is a former fauna field assistant at Toronto Region Conservation Authority and a conservation technician at the National Conservancy of Canada in Ontario, where she has conducted field inventory and monitoring programs. So we have with us Ms. Cheng, who has a broad international experience to share with us her perspectives as well. We will later hear from Mr. Teng, who is the Vice President of the Paradise Foundation and also the Chief Community Conservation Team Leader. He has had a broad background in the past in aircraft design, documentary filming, and has been also leading the conservation work for the Paradise Foundation since 2004. He has served as a with Conservation International for 13 years and focused on stimulating local communities towards conservation. He has a lot of experience in conservation agreements within communities in India, Indonesia, and Cambodia. So he comes with also an international experience and currently works with Paradise Foundation. So we have three compelling speakers, and we'll start with Lucy. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Frederick, and thank you very much, everyone. And you're all welcome to the discussion, and looking forward to hear your questions. I would like also first to thank the speakers, the previous speakers, because it was really very interesting, especially how Mr. Obura kind of summarized and put and gave us data, which is normally unavailable to be able to gauge on where we are as we speak on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It was very interesting also to hear from China and see how the Paradise organization has really worked. And as the question came by, when I was listening, I was wondering where the communities would be by, looking at that part of restoration. And Adija, thank you very much for taking up my role also in terms of explaining Indigenous people's issues, which I think you've already opened the door. I'll be talking about the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities, conservation efforts, and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And first, just wanted to give a short 2 minutes to say, who are these Indigenous peoples and local communities are we talking about, especially focusing on the African region? We have the Indigenous peoples described as people who are still, very strong in their cultures, traditions, and have been following their work and have never lived away from conservation, have also been holding on to their cultures and traditions very closely. And we have also examples from Africa. We have the pastoralists from the East African region. We also have pastoralists from the northern part, the Tuareg, and their relatives of the Amazigh. We have the Fulani, we have the Mbororo, who are also in West Africa and Central Africa. And so we have quite a number of a big family of the pastoralists. And then when we go to the hunter-gatherers, it's also a very large family, both in Kenya, in East Africa. We have the Ogiek, we have the Sengwer, we have quite a number of them spread up in different parts of the region, and also other smaller hunter-gatherers, and also others are either they're either pastoralists or either are they hunter-gatherers, and also fisher folks that we have within our own region. We have a larger big group of the Pygmy family. It starts from Uganda, it goes all the way to DRC and to Central Africa, where we have the Batwa, we have the Pygmy, we have the other, Baka people who are living within the central part of Africa. And I think we also have other minority groups that are moving from one place to the other, who are having different economic livelihoods, so moving from one country to the other. And that is what is a big dynamic about Indigenous peoples. They are almost related, starting from North Africa, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, and so on, to Sudan, to the whole of Africa. And also, like, we have them spread up in different areas. For example, in Kenya, we have different hunter-gatherer groups who are spread in different counties. And recently, I just came back from working with the Wata, who are spread up in Marsabit, in Isiolo, and in Tana River. So you can see the dynamics out there. And I wanted to do that so that at least some of our colleagues may also understand, why do we keep on talking about Indigenous peoples and local communities within the African region? And as usual, everybody says we are all Indigenous in the region. So it was very important to be able to explain that. And in the Southern Africa, we have the San community also there. There are also governments, as Adija had already explained, of some of the reasons why indigenous people in the region keep on, lagging a bit slow in terms of being recognized, because quite a number of governments have also not recognized these unique families which are there as indigenous people and their own other relatives who are also local communities living among them. And to say also that we as indigenous peoples, we have been working on issues of conservation for decades, I think since our great-grandfathers, and that is well known in terms of protecting our biodiversity, protecting our environment, and taking care of nature, because we know that whatever we have in the nature is given by God, and it is something that we have to preserve. It's something that we have to look at it and look at sustainable use to make sure that we don't destroy it, but we rather try to continue nurturing it. And in terms of looking at the participation of these particular groups that I'm talking about in the different areas of environment, especially following the Convention on Biological Diversity, and also looking at the issues of climate change, desertification, and those who are living in wetlands, and all the areas of environmental conservation, just like what Mr. Obura was talking about in terms of looking at the oceans and the waters. We are spread up in all those different places, and we have our role in terms of looking at those particular areas. We have also been able to participate, not only as Africa actually, in terms of bringing some of the key issues on the table to make sure that our governments can understand us and can be able to really listen to what we are saying and taking up our recommendations as a region, and differently working from our own different countries. The Convention on Biological Diversity, as you all know, under the Article 8J, has brought indigenous people for a long time together to be able to have a working group and work on their own to explain on their ways of conservation and why traditional knowledge is very critical in terms of conserving these particular areas. And we've continued participating in different conventions, in different discussions, and also being able to contribute effectively on issues of protected areas, and being able to contribute on those other issues that come out with the Conference of Parties, the decisions that come out, and how we input them to be able to include and recognize the role played by indigenous people. On issues of the convention, also looking at Nagoya Protocol and other supplementary protocols within the different discussions, we've made sure that we have been very effectively participating and explaining ourselves and being able to work with our governments. The unique thing also about the African indigenous peoples and the local communities is that we have been unique in terms of working very closely with our governments. And we decided to make sure that we work with them. The parties to the convention, as you all know, the convention has different areas of work. And we have focal points in different parts of the working, especially in terms of looking at the Nagoya Protocol, access and benefit sharing, looking at the different objectives. We've also been working very closely in terms of looking at sustainable use, and also in terms of looking at the other objectives and working with the focal points for the convention as a whole of biodiversity. And this has helped us to try and make the governments really understand and really be able to recognize the fact that we have these unique communities, and these communities are still working and living in their own traditional way of lives, and have also been really keen in terms of continuing conserving and looking at different species that we have and conserve them and look after them in a very effective way. When the review of the post-2020 global framework came in and the decision came up, we were also very keen in terms of looking at different areas. And I really like the way Mr. Bura really was able to explain very clearly, and looking at the post-2020, the discussion, and looking at the Aichi targets that have been also been highlighted very clearly. And looking at some of the targets that he has already mentioned, that has been actually our focus on our discussion today, the target 2 on the post-2020, and looking at the 30-30 and the protected areas and so on. And what indigenous people are really saying is that we really want our rights to be recognized. We want the parties to the convention, the world, the private sector, and other partners have to make sure that they recognize Indigenous people's role in terms of conserving, in terms of even in the protected areas. What are we talking about? Why should we not be, why are the rights not really being included within the discussion? Because we know, I think you all know, and I don't have to go back, what always happens in different countries when they want to create areas for large scale farming, for any other areas, even for protected areas. The first people who are displaced and the first people who are pushed out of those particular areas are the Indigenous peoples and their local communities who are around. We know quite a number of people already who have been, moved out of their home, like the Batwa of Uganda and others. I just mentioned a few. I don't want to mention all, and I don't want to go to that debate because it's a very interesting debate that really has become something that Indigenous people have been taking up very clearly and very strongly. And despite the fact that the Indigenous people have also been looking at those rights, they have also come up with their own initiatives of trying to make sure that they form their own Indigenous conserved, community conserved areas so that they can be able to work closely together and work with partners who can help them to forge forward and to make sure that they can give examples, that they can give ideas and say, look at these conserved areas. We have made them and we have been able to make sure that at least we are protecting and conserving our own biodiversity and making sure that those any species which is within those conserved areas is well protected. And we know that and have examples of how successful some of the communities have gone. We have, of course, like in Namibia, we have examples of the way they are conserved areas, they have been able to manage them on their own. And we have also in Kenya, in some of the areas, like recently in December 2020, the Ilwesi community, Maasai community from Laikipia, were able to put their work together for some years, and they have been able to get a title of their own conserved area. That is for the community. They can do their own conservation activities. They can be able to protect, they can do their restoration. They can speak together and be able to see how they can manage their land and their conserved area. This is the main purpose of doing that. We also know that there are some other communities who have been successful in those conserved areas, in conservancies, in Masai Mara, Amboseli and other areas. And for example, we have communities like Kimendet, Nyekweri Kimendet community towards the Transmara area near just the Masai Mara, where they have come together also as different communities looking at issues of destruction that already the degraded land and how people are encroaching into their land and nobody's listening to them. And they've come up with their own pieces of land and put them together and are now strongly working together to be able to register a conservancy where they can be able to really look after their land and their wildlife. And their wildlife move around with them just all over. When they move around, they live with them, just bringing that old concept of the Maasai again. We have also some communities, I'm sure the ones from the coast who are from the Kaya and so on, and also from other countries. They are doing the same, trying to make sure that at least they can be able to have the governments recognize this particular importance of them working together. But we have, of course, many challenges. We have challenges as we are working with trying to make sure that the issue of conservation, the issue of 3030 that he has already explained very well, and I really don't want to go back into it. And what we are saying is that issues of rights for Indigenous people are very, very crucial, that they have to be recognized, and that Indigenous peoples are part of their own system and productivity, and they know also about the traditional knowledge that they have, the customary use of biodiversity that has to be recognized. Unfortunately, we have to keep on reminding our parties to the convention and also other key players about this. And that's why we are really insisting on the rights and recognition. We are also worried that most of the policies that have already been introduced in many countries, those policies are just there on paper, but they are not really very well implemented. And this is why we are saying that for Indigenous people won't get tired. We will continue making sure that we really discuss and talk and and work with the allies like what we are discussing right now with China, because we know that the Conference of Parties is going to China. So we want to, this is a very good step towards working with different partners so that we can be able to see what are the issues that we can have them also be our allies in terms of helping us push them during the 15th Conference of Parties. We also want to urge the governments to look Indigenous people as peoples who are already doing a lot of work in terms of conservation, and that their rights are important. It's very important. You cannot go protecting anything without those communities. They are the ones who live right there in front of the, inside and outside the protected areas. And it's very, very important to be able to work with them and manage all those processes together, and also include them in terms of making any policies, any work that is being done. It's very important to make sure that they are really fully involved. I think we also, most of the people earlier on did not speak about COVID-19, but I think this is something that has taught us a lot. It has brought us quite a lot in terms of looking at where are we as a country, how do we look at our lands and see how we can be able to restore some of our environments that have been really destroyed and distracted. Why am I saying that? Because during COVID, people were limited in terms of movements, and they've been able to sit back and look at and reflect on the different work that they do. And they are looking at different areas. For example, our communities already, the Indigenous peoples, they were able to go back and look at some of the issues that have already been disappearing slowly away from them. Traditional medicine, for example, traditional Indigenous plants that they have already gone to restore them. Indigenous women have been working a lot in terms of restoration, planting trees. And I really like the way Bora said that if you have a small land, make sure that you have a small place you can plant. What the women and other communities are doing in different parts of not only Kenya, but also in other areas, in other countries, is that they make sure that at least in every small space, they put in, the Indigenous women put in some of the most important plants and vegetation, and also the fruits and everything that they know they need. Because during COVID, there was no movement. You couldn't move to go and look for anything anywhere else. So you are able to sit now and reflect and see what can we do and what can we change. And I think it's not only for Indigenous peoples, but it's also for the for all allies as we work together. We have seen a lot of issues that have come up, which are very, very important. And I think for this region, for Africa, we should also be focused in looking at what do we do in future. How do we work together to be able to manage such pandemics, such disasters that can come, not only pandemic, but like now we have volcanoes in DRC, and this is going also to distract some of the environment. How do we work together in terms of looking at such issues? So these are some of the issues that I wanted to bring up, and to look and focus on these particular areas. We are calling them protected areas, but they are also areas which are really well managed by our own communities, and they should be recognized. And the rights of these communities have to be included in most of the work that is being done. And asking the governments to look at the UN Declaration of Indigenous Population and see how important it is in terms of saying why they should work with the communities. I know I've gone over almost 3 minutes over my time, but I want to say thank you very much, and I look forward for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And for those of you who just joined us, this is a discussion between the China CSO group and the Africa CSO group on biodiversity in Africa. The focus is on the role of Indigenous people and their contributions through other effective conservation measures. We've just had finalized one panel discussion that involved Mr. Liu, David Obura, and Ms. Adija. We've just started a second panel discussion led by Lucy, who has just elaborated for us the key issues affecting Indigenous people and their effectiveness in engaging with conservation. The four things actually Lucy highlighted, just to summarize. The first thing she highlighted was that it's important to bring Indigenous people together so that they can organize and engage their voice strongly in platforms and processes. So that whole duty of organizing and bringing people together was one. The second thing I heard from Lucy was the need to recognize the rights of Indigenous people and recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people, because all too often Indigenous lands and areas are taken over quite easily when there's a need for infrastructure development or other forms of development. So recognizing the rights is key. The third key thing that I thought I heard from Lucy was the need for Indigenous communities alongside other communities to engage in community conservation, and that they've been doing that over the years, so that recognizing the role of Indigenous people and communities in their contribution to conservation is key, and that needs to be articulated better. And then lastly, what I heard was also the impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous people and local communities, and the need for the world community to focus and invest in empowering these communities so they can address the issues that pertain to COVID-19, but also contribute to the prevention of future pandemics. So essentially, these are the highlights of what I had. I will now pass this on to our next speaker, who is Mr. Cheng. Mr. Cheng is from Paradise Foundation, and he would share with us some reflections in this respect. Over to you, Mr. Cheng.
Hello, do you mind if I share screen?
Please do.
Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. I think, yeah, it's good afternoon for all the people in China, and good morning, Africa. So yeah, thanks for inviting me to join this webinar, and I'm very honored to be here and present my project, community participation in conservation and livelihood improvement, and share you guys with Myanmar as a case of CSA model. So my name is Yunju, and I'm a program officer working in Global Environmental Institute. Just a very brief introduction of Global Environmental Institute. We're actually a Chinese nonprofit, non-government organization, funded, registered, and based in Beijing, China since 2004. And our mission is to design, execute, and support market-based models and policy recommendations that solve environmental problems in order to achieve development that is economically, ecologically, and socially sustainable. So basically, we have several programs. We have programs that's working on climate change, and we have programs that working in marine conservation. So the program I was working at is for ecosystem conservation and community development. Basically, we all think that the engagement of Indigenous people and local communities is critically important for biodiversity conservation. So that's why we've been working for over 15 years now that engage communities and try to find a balance between development and conservation. So GEI has been working in several countries now, except China and Myanmar. We also have projects in a lot of countries in Africa, such as Congo, Cameroon, and Ghana and Liberia. What is CCCA? This is actually a model we used to engage communities in conservation while helped them with to develop sustainably. So the full name for Community Conservation Concession Agreement is short for CCCA, and is actually a conservation model to give environmental protection rights and the limited development rights in protected areas to different stakeholders in the form of an agreement. Through CSA model, communities can enhance their commitment to the land, and the government becomes a partner in land conservation. Basically, this is the model that we use that to engage local communities and to not let government to be the only one that's doing all the works in land protection. We want the communities and the indigenous people to be a part of it. So how it works. So this is the basic concept of the model. Is actually based on the conservation agreement that was developed by Conservation International since 2005. So the two key points of this model is conservation actions and benefits. So the conservation actions should be addressed threats to biodiversity and or the ecosystem services. So the conservation actions could be examples like the commitment of the local people and local communities and indigenous people of their promises of no poaching or no forest clearing, or we can ask them to become a part of the actions, such as they can do patrolling together with the forest department, or they can participate in the forest restoration actions. And the benefits is an exchange for their actions taken. Benefits could be a lot of things, such as social services, livelihood support, such as trainings for like farming or training for livestock raising, or like it can be conservation wages, such as if you go patrolling and we can give you like wages if you go patrol. So in this case, you will have a job that's related to protection instead of destroy the forest. And those are the examples. So the benefits have to be greater than the cost for conservation to be an attractive choice for local people, which means that the people, for example, if they used to be cutting trees, logging for a living, and now you want them to stop logging and you want them to protect the forest, then if you give the wages for them to go patrol, it should be more than what they can get from the logging. So this is the basic concept of the model, and it's an agreement of exchange between the stakeholders that owns land, have the rights of protection, and the indigenous people and local communities. So for GEI, so over the past, now it's more than 12 years actually, we have been adapting the model in pilots, improve, and innovate conservations in China with over 150,000 hectares of community protected areas, and with over 65,000 local people that benefit from this model. So this is a map that we have been promoted this model in a lot of communities in China, and it's not all GIS work. It's just a combine of all the similar models that are being used in China. So as an example of Myanmar, first of all, I want to give a general review of what we did in Myanmar. So basically in Myanmar, we've been working there since 2016, and it has been over 2 phases. So the first phase is actually started in 2016, and I've been introduced to Myanmar of the CSA model by 4 NGOs that in local NGOs that collaborate with GEI, and we have 16 rural communities in the region, and we have covered a lot of key biodiversity areas in Myanmar, such as Mek Archipelago, Alanda Kasapa National Park, and Central Bogoyoma Mountains. So these projects have to help conserve over 10,000 acres of land and engaged over 3,000 of rural households. And the phase 2, we actually it started since 2018, and we just want to expand all the impact. So we get supported by the CPF, and we now still working with those partners and expand the project from 16 communities to 27 communities. And we have increased in 2 more critical ecosystems, the very famous Inle Lake, and also Moyonju wetlands. So, and we increased the area to over 40,000 acres, and households and the local communities increased to 4,500, and with over 20,000 people that's involved in this project. So this is a brief map of what we did in Myanmar. So it's all across Myanmar from south part to a bit of central Myanmar. And we have 4 NGOs that's working with us. Myanmar Environment Institute, Ecosystem Conservation and Community Development Initiative, short for ECCDI. We have Community Development Action, City Action, and Myanmar Forest Association. So each of them are working in different areas in Myanmar. So for example, the MFA is working at the southern part of Myanmar, which is more like a coastal area. They've been focusing on mangrove conservation. And in the central Myanmar, which is very close to the Yangon, Myanmar, the city actions. So they focus on Bogoyoma region and the Moyonju wetland right here. And for ECCDI, they are more based in Shan State, which is more like a forest area in Myanmar. And also they also expand their community to Inland Lake, which is one of the biggest lake in inland lake in Myanmar. And MEI is working more northern part, and it's working in the Myanmar's first national park, Alandang Coastal Park National Park area. So there's 4 elements of CC in Myanmar. So we have, of course, conservation, and then the second is the community development. Of course, those are the 2 keys of the CC model. But besides this, we add more things in Myanmar. First is that we add community fund. So this will be established within a CCC model to sustainably support conservation and community development for the long run. So because we want local people, in the Myanmar, it's very complicated that each communities have different livings and their needs are different. So, and we also have to think about the sustainability of the project. If we leave the project, how we can be running this for a longer time. Then this idea, the community fund, was popped up because we have successful stories in China. But in Myanmar, we actually think maybe we can also continue this in Myanmar. So with the help of local NGOs, we've established over 20 community funds. Each of them are very small, not that much money, but it will be set in the communities and the management by the local community people. And they can use it as loans to support their sustainable livelihood. And then with interest, they can come back to the fund and make the fund bigger and support conservation works such as patrol. Such as for patrol, they can get more benefits from these funds. And besides funds, we also have the climate goods. So it's through South-South Climate Cooperation. The aid supplies were integrated in this project. It's actually a part of the climate aid donations from China to Myanmar government. And then since we've been working with the Myanmar government for quite a long time, and we think maybe some of the aid goods can go through our project to give more incentives to our project communities to participate in this project. So I will just really give an example of project that happened in Mek Archipelago, which is the southern part of Myanmar, conducted by MFA. It's a mangrove conservation project. So mangrove forest in Myanmar, Myanmar has more than 2,000 kilometers of coastal land, and it has a really nice mangrove forest, and it was conserved very well. But due to the expansion of agriculture and fast growth of populations, the mangrove has decreased by approximately 50% in 2002. And mangrove actually is really important for all the local communities there, because it can not only is a really big carbon sink, and also it can enhance the coastline stability and also provide food and building materials for the communities right there. So there are 7 communities that in the 2 islands there that participate in this project. So this is a map of the conservation that we did. So basically the conservation actions that take by those communities are listed right here. So first of all, they have signed conservation agreements for 5 years of each community. And then we conduct trainings, and over 80 people from the communities participate in 5 trainings that for mangrove species identification and awareness raising. So basically, we wanted to let them know the climate change impact and why mangrove is important to storage the carbon and also protect the coastline for them. And the second thing is that we established over 2,000 acres of mangrove conservation areas with signboards and borderlines. So basically, this is mapped right here. So those areas with numbers are actually mangroves that's protected by the communities, and they number them, and each community was distributed to like 2 pilots or 3 pilots. So if, for example, Canty has pilot 8 and pilot 14, so those are the areas they need to protect if you belong to the Canty village. So they will go patrol with the local forest department every month, so to make sure that it is cutting mangrove. And then the next thing they did is species surveys, and the local people actually are working with the scientist group from MFA to identify there are over 28 mangrove species in the protected areas, and 2 of them are actually really critically endangered species. I think they introduced to me that those 2 species are less than 500 in the IUCN list, but they never surveyed Myanmar, so they don't know how much of these species in Myanmar. So, but besides Myanmar, there are only like 500 species, mangrove species of that kind. So the next thing they do is nursery. So they raise over 37,000 mangrove seedlings with all different species, and they especially raise the critical endangered species of mangroves in their nursery garden to plant them. And the patrolling, I already mentioned that they collaborate with local FDE to patrol twice every month. And for livelihood development, we've been doing trainings for them to do pig raising and fruit tree planting. And 2 community funds was established because there are 7, even though there are 7 communities, they are very small ones, and they have, so we think it's better to not establish community funds in every little village. So we just established 2 funds in 2 islands, and so to combine those villages together. So the total amounts for those funds are over $3,000 US, and has 2 rounds and already benefit 116 beneficiaries. And we have distributed fruit tree seedlings and such as mango, and we also have distributed 75 clean cook stoves and household solar lighting systems. So that's also, I mentioned that it's a part of the donations from China to Myanmar, and we distribute in those communities here. And so we've actually had an evaluation of the income increase. So those are the income increase for MFA's project sites. And in general, all the projects we did in Myanmar, the local communities have increased 17% of their incomes for any families that participate in this project. So the overall outcomes, I've already introduced a bit. So conserved over 40,000 acres of land in 5 key biodiversity areas, and we have helped the Myanmar government to enhance their protections of their land, and we have 100% of people from the communities increase their knowledge of climate change and forest degradation, and we also assist them to establish 22 community funds, and with a total amount of $50,000 US, and we also help them to develop multiple new livelihoods such as pig raising and fruit tree planting. So the extra outcome is the climate change things that I already mentioned. So I'll pass that. So this is the donation of the household use solar lighting system. And that's all for my presentation. And thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me or ask in the chat, and I will answer it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ching. First of all, I'm sorry I didn't introduce you adequately. So Ms. Ching works for GEI, the Global Environmental Institute, isn't it? And thanks for the really powerful presentation about the work you guys have been doing. There's a question for you in the questions box. You want to check that out. And then maybe as you look at the question, I will ask Mr. Tiang to respond or provide his reflections. So we'll go to Mr. Tiang, and then Ms. Ching, we come back to you later. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mr. Tiang.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Chen, for the very wonderful presentation. And okay, I try to speak in Chinese. I think it's easier for me. 从上面2位的这个发言中间，我觉得是非常有意思的。首先是说，当我们去讨论这个未来要做这个保护的时候，刚才这个 Obra 这个其实也说过，就是我们想要增加多少的保护的这个面积，但是很显然包括像中国这样的这种超强政府的国家，要想去增加这种严格保护的面积，都是一个非常困难的事情。那在其他国家其实也是同样，我们想要增加保护区的面积，基本上的可能性是很小的了。那我们又需要增加保护的面积来实现生物多样性的保护，那很显然我们能打的主意就是怎么能够提高这种社区土地上的这个保护的可能性。那我觉得这个奥布拉先生贡献了一个特别好的一个词儿，叫做shared area， 是吧？共享的这个模型哈。那就是说未来我们想要保护生物多样性，可能我们要增加保护面积的最有可能的途径，就是激励当地社区参与到保护中间来，而不再有多大的可能去划建更多的严格的保护地或者国家公园什么的。第二个就是我有一种很深的感受哈，就是不管是在中国，在东南亚，在非洲，其实我们都是原住民的大陆，我们都没有像美国那样是吧，把那个原住民印第安人赶尽杀绝以后划建国家公园那样的这个土壤，我们都是不存在的。所以在我们这儿做保护的时候，我们完全没有办法去学习美国那样的国家公园的那样的模型，我们不得不去考虑大量的当地社区和原住居民的问题。那怎么去考虑这些问题呢？比如过去我们很容易就把当地居民看成是生物多样性保护的障碍和威胁，我们想得出来的办法就是把他们赶走，移出去，划建严格的保护区。但是很显然，这条路第一不合理，第二也走不通了。那我们在目前的这种状态下，又想增大保护面积，又不可能再把人移走的这样的原住民大陆上的这些国家，可以怎么样来提高我们的保护这种生物多样性的那些面积呢？那很显然就是我们需要跟当地原住居民进行合作，而不再是把他们看成是障碍。我特别同意 Lucy 的说法，在很多原住居民，尤其这种原住民哈， 他长期生活在这片土地上，其实他自己的生产生活方式跟当地的自然环境之间已经形成了非常紧密的关系，并且也形成了他们跟自然条件之间的这种治理的一些逻辑在里头。那这些东西其实都可以变成我们保护的同盟军。所以其实我们真正在一些原住民的社区要去开展保护的时候，其实反而我们的所面临的难度不会那么特别大。比如说在这个藏族人的社区啊，比如说我们有那个神山圣境这个 Holy Mountain 这种概念哈，你都会发现我们跟原住居民是很容易在保护上达成一致的，因为当地的环境保护好了之后，当地老百姓首先是直接跟他利益相关的。因此我们认为在未来的这个保护中间，怎么去激发当地居民参与到保护中间来，就会变成是未来我们做保护的最重要的一个任务。所以这可能对于做保护的这些专业人员或者 NGO 或者政府来讲，这都是未来需要高度重视的一个方面。这个我特别同意Lucy 的那个说法。那怎么能够让当地居民参与到保护中间来呢？这是一个巨大的挑战。那也非常感谢这个陈女士给我们提供的这个案例哈。我们怎么通过一个 CCA 的这么一个模型，让当地的居民能够参与到保护中间来？那我觉得在这种 CCA 这种模型呢，它还是有一点西方模型的那么个意思。我个人是认为呢，我们要想让当地居民加入到我们保护中间来，那除了要有 CC 这种模式以外，那在 CC 的模式的利用之前，其实我们应该有一个更重要的工作。这种工作是什么？就是要去充分理解当地原住居民他们的生产生活方式跟自然环境、自然条件之间的关系是什么。第二一个就是要去理解当地的原住居民他们内部治理、管理自己内部的公共事务的那套机制是什么。这两者应该成为我们撬动当地居民参与到保护中间来的重要的条件。那如果有了这两个条件，再加上一些比如说我们前面刘晓根提到的那个老河沟保护区怎么撬动当地居民的做法，加上这个GEI 怎么在缅甸撬动当地居民的一些做法，那这样的话其实就是我们解决了那个理念上的问题，解决方法上的问题，这样我们才能够把当地的居民动员起来参与到保护中间来。我还在这想要额外再说一个是什么呢？就是当地老百姓他其实跟这种自然资源的这个利用的这种关系是关联是最紧的。如果能把当地老百姓的原住居民的生产生活的方式稍微有所改变，其实对保护就是巨大的贡献。保护不仅仅是说我们要去组织一个巡逻队去巡护，当地居民能够把自己的公共资源的利用给管好了，对他们的生产生活的方式有一点点的调整和约束，其实就是对保护的巨大的贡献。而且这种保护的成本相对来讲是非常低的，就是当地居民去做保护的成本远远比我们从外面派一个保护的机构、一个组织到那儿去，这个成本要低很多。所以作为我们保护的工作者来讲，可能未来很大的一个挑战就是我们怎么能从政策的倡导者、科学的研究者、保护的行动者转变为社区行动的那个协作人推动他们去做他们想要做成保护的事情。那么在这个时候，其实这个作为中国、非洲以及东南亚这些很多国家，虽然我们每个国家的国情不同，但是我们都是这种原住居民占主导的这么一些国家，其实在这一点上是很相似的。就其实在我们在保护的这个具体的做法上，在理念上，其实有很多的可以互相借鉴和学习的地方。所以其实在未来，我觉得这个我们在社区保护上面的这个很多的这种交流、分享、考察、学习都可以做起来，可以极大的 在不改变不需要把当地居民赶走的情况下，可以巨大的提升我们保护的这个空间。同时，我们可以把更多的当地的原住居民变成我们保护的同盟军。我就说这些，谢谢。
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Tieng. Your summary and conclusions around what you've heard was really, really powerful. I also want to thank Ms. Cheng for your presentation on the CCCA model, the community agreement model, which is a very powerful model, simplistic, but very powerful. There are key aspects of it that I know that people are already asking questions about. How do you build on, how do you create community funds, and how do you sustain community funds? That's something I think that we'd love to hear a little bit more from you about shortly. Maybe we've passed the noon hour, we've passed the 2-hour mark. And so I'm going to try and find a way that we try and conclude this, but not without taking the questions that have come up and also summarizing what I've heard. And I think there's a question for Ms. Cheng that I think would be nice for Ms. Cheng to respond to. There are 2 questions. The first one goes like this: where do you get the funding to set up community funds? And if you consider your fund successful, how do you capitalize it? What does it take to capitalize the fund? And then the second question is sort of related, and it's about where do you get your inputs? You talked about stoves and certain inputs for communities. Where do you get those from? Are those coming from China as well? So if you can tell us a little bit about the fund, how it is set up, what makes it sustainable, how do you capitalize it, and what happens when you leave with those funds? So over to you, Ms. Cheng.
Hi, yes. Sorry, I cannot open my camera right now. So I'll just use the mic. So thanks a lot for sharing, ask the questions. I actually did answer the questions by typing in. But also I would really like to share more about this community fund. The fund is actually, so where the money gets from, is actually from our donors. So basically, when we design the project, we already have this fund that's designed in this project. So it's a part of the whole project. So we've submit the budget with the fund and say that we want to set up several community funds that was managed and running by the local communities. And our donor is actually really supportive of this idea. So it becomes a part of the budget. So that's how we set the fund. And our donor is the Blue Moon Fund at that time from the United States. So that's how we get the money from. And about how it works is actually first of all, we ask our partners, our local NGO partners, to go talk with the community people about the fund, whether they would like to join this project or not. And well, if you join the project and if you conduct conservation actions, and we can set a community fund for you guys and to discuss how much they will need to set the fund. And so it's more like a conversation, talking with local communities and discussion, and then it will be settled and written in the agreement that owing people who participate in conservation works can use the fund, can get the loans. So this is more like a motivation or incentive for people to join for conservation actions. If you don't join, if you don't protect the environment there, you don't have the right to use the fund. So that's how we can get almost all the community members to join. And the community fund will be managed and running by the local communities, and the local communities set up the project committee with people selected from the community. Most time it's like 3 to 5 people that's selected by the local communities themselves, and there will be accounting and bookkeeping and in these communities to manage the fund, and will be monitored by the local NGOs that's been implementing the work. So when the fund started to set, local people can apply to get loans, and so they will have to introduce what they will be used the loan for, and how much, what time can they get back, will pay back the loans, and interest is also discussed by the local communities, and how much it's interested, how much of the interest local communities can accept. So it's all through discussion with local communities, and they design themselves actually. So each community has different interests for the community fund, and then everything settled, people can apply, and they will get the loans, and they will be used for buying like seedlings or buying piglets to raise, and they in most cases they have to pay back within a year and with interest. And so after a year, they will collect all the interest, and the fund will be getting bigger, and it can get loans for more people. So that's a round for the community fund. And meanwhile, if they have some spending, they have some cost when they are doing patrolling and when they need to do conservation, they can the communities can announce the cost of these actions, and let other people know that will be spent this much money for our conservation works. So it can also taken from the fund. So which means that there will be continuing funding, like some monies kept in the communities to support conservation and community development. So some of the communities will already being stopped our projects for over 2 years now already, but the fund is still running in the communities and organized by the local committee, even the project ends, because they have to keep getting loans from the fund, and they'll have to keep paying back. So it's like the project is still going without the project. I hope that's clear. So it's like this thing is still going on, even though the project ends, but people are still knowing that, oh, this is from the project, and we have to do conservation works in case of to get the loans. And our NGOs, local NGOs, are still have good relation with local communities, and they will check their every month or several months to make sure that the fund is still there. So that's how the community fund is working in Myanmar right now.
Thank you very much. That's really powerful. Thanks for sharing of the model. I am pressed for time because we are 12 minutes past time. So with the permission of everyone, I'm going to try and wrap up what we've just heard. And again, thanks to Mr. Tieng, because I think he has done almost 50% of that work for me already. But let me just go back in terms of what have we had today and what are the take homes that we perhaps can carry forward. So what we've had beginning with David Obura was a conceptual framing of how we can engage with special protection across all spaces. So from the pristine area to the rural area where we have indigenous people and local communities, to peri-urban areas and urban areas, that across all these spaces, collectively, we all have a responsibility to engage, and that there should be a focus on clarifying ways of engagement, including targets for these areas and spaces of engagement. David Obura also went further to share an example of how that works within the marine protected areas, primarily in Kenya. And he shared examples of how local communities organize to protect and also to gain benefits, and how they bring in local government to support those efforts. So there are clear targets, but there are also clear incentives, and there's an organization process that goes on there that empowers communities to engage with their marine spaces, but also benefit from it. We then heard from Mr. Liu on a very powerful presentation relating to restoration of a forest farm that has become quite significant in contributing to the panda landscape of over 150 square, I think it was 150 square kilometers of land. Significant work done in restoring the forest, but also ensuring that communities are engaged within that forest. And ultimately, the benefit has been that there's been regeneration of biodiversity, with species coming back and communities benefiting from projects and initiatives that are supported by Paradise Foundation. So very powerful example of a restoration program. And I think that kind of example indicates again how one can engage along the spaces. We then later heard from Lucy about the role of Indigenous people. She clearly and powerfully indicated the role that Indigenous people play in conserving biodiversity, indicating that the current situation is that most of biodiversity is in the spaces of Indigenous communities, especially in Africa and certainly in China and the other parts of the world. And it is estimated that 40% of biodiversity is in the spaces where Indigenous and people and local communities are residing. And that essentially means that more effort needs to be made to empower these communities, ensure that their rights are upheld, and then encourage and that they are encouraged to help protect what they are already protecting, but to take it to the next level. She raised a challenge in terms of the pressures on Indigenous communities and lands from development and the implications there. And that's something we all need to keep in mind. How do we deal with the issues of our consumption and production patterns so that it reduces the pressures on Indigenous communities? There were issues raised also around knowledge transfer and funding to support communities. We then heard from Ms. Cheng, a very powerful and interesting presentation about community agreements, conservation agreements, and examples both in China and Myanmar, and the impact on communities, both in terms of conservation, but as well in terms of reducing poverty and impacting their livelihoods in a very powerful way. She later on talked about how community funding mechanisms are set up in a revolving way so that they are sustainable. So we've heard from all of us in a very powerful way. I would like to summarize briefly the key highlights and drawing on Mr. Tieng's comments. The first thing that I hear from Mr. Tieng, which I also want to emphasize, is that the situation in Africa and in China are alike. We are talking about spaces and land that have been traditionally owned by local people. This is not a land where people have come to occupy and dictate what happens in terms of spaces. This is the land where you have Indigenous people who and local communities who have a right to those pieces of land and need to be engaged in the formulation of the changes in land use and the conservation of land in those spaces. So that's a very key point. The second is the understanding of those spaces and how they interact with nature. He talked about internal governance, understanding how people govern themselves and their relationship with nature. And it's only through that understanding then that we can propose and work with communities to change or evolve their ways of conservation, taking it to the next level. The third thing that I personally take out of this is also that beyond focusing on Indigenous people and local communities, we need to focus on the entire system, and especially production and consumption practices, because those put a lot of pressure on local communities. How we develop our roads, what we consume, the food we consume, and our need for more and more nature basically puts pressures on local systems. So a discussion I think that we should have at a later stage is how do we who live in urban areas produce and demand for production and consumption in ways that then impact communities. And then the last thing is about financing and knowledge, I would say. How do we create an enabling environment through resource transfers, finances, and a good example is the GEI example of community funds. How do we create sustainable funding mechanisms and also transfer knowledge to local communities? So overall, we've had some powerful points from everyone. And I think what we are saying is that other effective conservation measures are as effective as protected areas and actually very essential because they occupy a certain amount of space that if we do not conserve and protect will undermine protected areas in any way. So bringing these two pieces together, conserving our pristine areas with local communities and indigenous people, but also working with indigenous people to conserve the areas that they occupy, which are essential for conservation, is important. The third area would be for us later to have a discussion about urban areas and the role development plays and its impact on conservation as a whole. But essentially, that's the take I have made of today's conversation. And I want to thank the presenters, Lucy, David, Ms. Cheng, and Mr. Liu, alongside the discussant, Ms. Adija, and Mr. Tieng for your contributions. Thank you very much. I will pause just to see if my facilitators have any further guidance for me. Otherwise, I think we've had a wonderful discussion from everyone. And thanks for coming. Without your presence, these meetings don't actually go far. Your presence makes this happen. We are thankful that you've helped us make a second webinar successful. We'll plan a third one in July. We'll look for the topic that is most appropriate, and we will share that with you. So until we meet again together in July, thank you very much. Our facilitators will send to you the presentations, and you want to take note of our facilitators. There is Sharon Anderson, she's put her contacts there, and there is Ms. Wang as well. Take those contacts, but they would reach out to you with the presentations. And if you have further questions or any needs, they will put you in touch directly with the presenters as well. So you can reach out directly with everyone. So thanking everyone again. I would like to personally thank Mr. Pong for bringing this platform together with the China CSOs, and also thank our colleagues at the Africa CSO perspective, Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance also for coming together. Great session today. Thank you all very much. And with this, I will bring the meeting to a close. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Bye-bye. Thanks all. Good to hear everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Hey everyone. Thanks, Fred. Amazing.
Thank you.
Everyone. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Gia.
Thank you, Fred.